So it's been an extraordinary month in global affairs since US President Donald Trump came back to office for his second term. We've seen all kinds of threats, from reciprocal tariffs to a trade war to wanting to take over Gaza and make it into a Riviera. But I guess the most consequential just happened this past week, which is the first ever high-level contact between Russian and American officials since the start of the Ukraine war. And next week, the Ukraine war will complete 3 years. So let's try and telescope into the future and see, how the world may be responding to Trump in various issues that have now come to the fore in these past few weeks. I'm now joined by Sir Martin Wolf. He's the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times. Thank you very much, Sir Martin Wolf, for speaking with us on CNN News 18. I want to start with the Russia-US rapprochement, if I can use that word, because we had the first ever high-level contact this past week between Secretary Rubio and Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia. There's indications that as early as next week, Presidents Trump and Putin could meet again in Saudi Arabia. Just how big a deal is this?
Well, it's clearly a very big deal. Basically, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, as you said, the West ceased to deal with Russia directly and imposed very stringent sanctions upon it and backed Kiev unambiguously in this struggle. Whether adequately is another matter. Now, it is pretty clear that Donald Trump's policies are entirely different. He has legitimized contact with Putin and therefore Putin himself, and he is purporting or claiming to be able to reach a bilateral deal that will resolve this problem, which is something his predecessor and all other Western governments denied. So this is a very, very radical turning point in American policy towards Russia, towards Putin, and a clear and dramatic split in the NATO alliance.
What may be the consequences of that, both in the immediate term and in the medium term? In the immediate term, especially the language that Trump has used for Zelensky, calling him a dictator who's not faced elections and so on and so forth. Is Trump preparing to sort of throw Zelensky under the bus? That's in the immediate term. And in the medium term, as you said, if this is going to split NATO right down the middle, how may Europe respond, not just to the war in Ukraine, but also to overall transatlantic relations?
Well, I would not regard myself as a leading foreign policy expert, but I think the answers to your questions are pretty clear. I think it's a very good bet. I don't know whether one would regard it as a 90% probable or 80% probable. Nothing with Trump is 100% probable. Everybody knows that. He changes his policy several times a day. But it seems to me that it is probable that Zelensky is going to be thrown under a bus, as you put it. The nature of this throwing him under the bus, we don't yet know what the deal will be on paper, what guarantees, if any, the US will provide of Ukraine's security after it. All that we don't know, but clearly a ceasefire, it's not going to be a peace, is going to be imposed, or that's what Trump intends to do. We will see, because it might be that what Putin demands will be beyond what even Trump is prepared to concede on Ukraine's part. Then the second question is, what does this mean for Europe? Well, that's absolutely clear. That is 100% clear. The strategic environment for Europe is being transformed. The commitment of the Americans to NATO, as was made clear by the new Secretary of State for Defense in Munich, is being reduced, if not effectively withdrawn. Once the commitment is in question, then the whole NATO structure sort of falls apart, because the essence of it is the commitment of the US to come to the defense of any country that is attacked. And if that's in question, then the security blanket becomes very much in question. And it's always been an issue. And now, therefore, the Europeans are much more on their own. In a way, they haven't been since, well, I think it would have been about 1948. And and so it's a new strategic environment for Europe.
So I want to come to the tariff spot. And Trump, in the month that he's been in office, he's threatened and paused 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. He's implemented 10% tariffs on China, straight up 25% tariffs on imports of aluminum and steel. And now you've got the big one where he's saying it's going to be reciprocal tariffs on every trading partner that the United States does business with. What do you think is the likely impact of all of this?
Well, if he's serious about it, uh, and I have to question it because these ideas are so utterly ludicrous. I mean, the most important thing to understand about Donald Trump is that he is an ignoramus. He has no idea how world trade works, how the structure of tariffs, how tariffs work, nothing. But if he says, we are going to reciprocate every other country's barriers against us perfectly, which is an insane policy, by the way. There is no economist I'm aware of, even the most protectionist, interventionist, who would say that's a rational policy. But leave that aside. Assume he does it. Well, he's going to have very low tariffs on Europe because European tariffs are very low. Formally, China's tariffs are pretty low, so he's going to have to invent a whole lot of other barriers which are not recorded against which he will reciprocate. India, on the other hand, if he's going to go reciprocal, he's going to be hit very hard because India's tariffs are relatively high. And if he says, well, our tariffs against India should be exactly the same as India's tariffs on goods that we export, then that by definition, that's where the tariffs are going to be highest in America. That's what reciprocity will mean. This is a very old policy of the US, about 100 years old, actually. So in general, emerging and developing countries have higher tariffs, not all, but have higher tariffs than developed countries, simply because the developed countries started cutting their tariffs earlier, about 30, 40 years earlier. So this would create a very strange pattern of tariffs in which the tariff paid by American consumers of particular goods will depend on exactly where they come from, on which country it comes from. They'll all be different. So there will be many, many, many different tariffs for different products. Then there will have to be some questions raised about all the intermediate products that go into goods coming from, say, India or Vietnam or whatever. And then finally, there will be this very strange pattern that American protectionism will rise highest against relatively protectionist emerging and developing countries. Is that really going to happen? I have no idea because it's just so crazy.
But Trump has been using, for example, the example that he's been citing is cars. He says European cars are tariffed much lower in the United States than American cars are in Europe. Is there any merit to that argument? And he's saying as a way to get around it, come and manufacture in the United States.
It is true that as a result of a war which occurred back, if I remember, the 60s, this is a very long time ago, in that war, I think was called the Chicken War, but the details even I've forgotten, and I might be wrong on this. European tariffs on US cars ended up relatively high. But of course, and as a result, Europe doesn't import many cars from the US. But the truth is, Europe wouldn't import cars from America anyway, because American cars are completely unsuited to European conditions. And since Europe has, put it mildly, a very large car industry, which is extremely competitive in the internal combustion engine, and all the other competitive producers of motor vehicles are in Asia, Korea, Japan, and China, the chances that if we got rid of our tariffs, we would end up importing lots and lots of cars of these huge gas guzzler type from the US in a continent where fuel prices are so much higher, the chances are zero. It's just utter nonsense. But overall, European tariffs are very low on the US, as in general, until all this nonsense, were US tariffs because they were part of a reciprocal negotiation. And the reciprocal negotiation about tariffs, with exception of one or two anomalies like that between the US and Europe, started with the so-called Kennedy round in the 1960s, which is why I'm referring back to that time. So
Okay.
this is 60 years ago. So basically, it's just nonsense.
So you said, generally the tariffs are higher with developing countries like India. So we're just looking at some of the list of items where Trump wants India to lower tariffs, whether it's on agricultural produce, on meats, or on leather, on gems and jewelry. Now, the reason why countries like India, developing countries like India, have such high tariffs is because they don't want to be, they feel that their local industry won't be able to compete. Like, for example, Indian farmers won't be able to compete with imported stuff. What does a government like India do at the stage of development it is in right now to try and counter the threat of these reciprocal tariffs?
Well, the reason, indeed, that developing countries are allowed to have higher tariffs and also, in certain circumstances, quantitative restrictions, is that there were exceptions explicitly in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization, now vilified institutions, to protect the right of developing countries to do just that. And developed countries, including the US and the Europeans and the Japanese, all accepted that. So Trump is repudiating quite openly the system of ideas embedded in the GATT WTO that allowed developing countries to make the arguments you have made. So I would say it's a very unfriendly act, and your prime minister should respond very vigorously. Now, whether the particular pattern of protection that the Indians have taken, this is a very complicated argument I don't want to go through, has been good for India, I think is an open question. It's a lot of debate. And by and large, I'm one of the people who feel that the liberalization India has gone through over the last 35 years has helped it. But on the specific issue, if the United States insists that India must reduce its tariffs on agriculture, and as I know very well, the extreme political and social sensitivity of farming in India, that will create a crisis for India. And I think the only possible thing for the Indian government to say in that situation is no. I mean, I just don't see what else they can say unless they can find some other way of supporting farming. And the only other way is through subsidies. And it would seem to me that India doesn't have the money to replace tariffs with subsidies very easily without completely transforming political fiscal policy. So it seems to me that India has to say, this is what we're allowed to do. This is in our interests. And we're going to have to find some way together, and we have very important mutual interests. So I would advise you, Mr. Trump, not to do this, and so we can continue to have a harmonious relationship.
All right. As we come to the concluding part, and I want to know your thoughts on this because this has again taken a lot of airtime on television. It's consumed a lot of newsprint space as well about what Trump intends to do in Gaza. He said some pretty outrageous things about making it into a Riviera. The Arab countries have gone into a twist and they've said it's unacceptable. What do you think he's trying to play at? Is he trying to get the Arab countries to try and find a solution to this problem? He seems to have given almost like a carte blanche to Israel and to Mr. Netanyahu.
Well, purely by chance, I've just come back from Israel, and all I can say from the people I've spoken to, not in the government, but people who are very interested, is they have absolutely no idea what he means. They are mostly very happy that he forced the ceasefire upon them, which allowed them to bring back the hostages. I imagine the people of Gaza are pretty happy that there's a ceasefire. So that's actually one of the few things he's done that I regard as really very positive. I mean, the killing is at the moment stopped. We must welcome that. Now, the question is, then what? Well, he's thrown this huge rock into the Mediterranean, as it were, metaphorical rock, saying, well, we're going to move everybody out of Gaza. Where are they going to go? And we're going to rebuild it as a Riviera. Are the Gazans going to come back? Who's going to go there? Nobody knows what this is supposed to mean. And people tend to the assumption that this is some sort of initial démarche statement, and that will start something off. But where it will lead to and what it would actually mean, I don't know. I've lots of ideas about it. Gaza, as it was clearly not a sustainable entity. Change will have to be found, but what the change will be and how it will fit into a wider settlement, nobody, at least I spoke to in Israel, has a clue.
And very quickly, if I may close, I just want to get one more question in. Do you see, through Trump and then Vance and also certainly through Elon Musk, a sort of coming together of these far-right parties? They seem to be sort of finding common cause with Reform in the UK, with Marine Le Pen's party in France, and most recently, and this will have consequences in the next few days, with the AfD in Germany. Some kind of an international coalition of far-right parties being stitched together?
There's something very strange about the idea of an international coalition of nationalists, isn't there? More or less by definition, that's not what nationalists do. So I would say they're parallel rather than real allies. And the other thing that has to be noted is that intellectually, they're spectacularly incoherent. So because in America, you have nativists who are passionately anti-immigrant and don't care about the world. And then at the same time, you have the tech plutocrats who are, by definition, global, love immigrants, because many of them are, and they employ them, many of them Indian, of course, and wonderful they are, and who want to conquer the world. So how does that fit together? I mean, it seems to me that the far right that we're looking at now, apart from a few, they hate all wokeness, whatever that is. I really don't know. But apart from that, I find it just completely intellectually incoherent. And in power, if you look at what Trump's administration is doing, it is incoherent. We don't have time to go through that in detail. So I don't think there's an international cartel of nationalists. They have parallelism, and all they really share is their enemies. And once they've squashed the woke and brought in racism and driven out a few immigrants, what's left of them?
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Mr. Martin Wolf, for joining us here on CNN News 18. Appreciate your time.
Great pleasure.